We can't afford now to have these national borders. We can't afford to have racism. We can't afford apartheid. We can't. It's one of those luxuries that we can't have anymore as human beings. We've got to think now in real terms for that seventh generation, and we've got to move in concert. We've got to sing the same songs. We've got to have the same ceremony. We've got to get back to the spiritual law if we are to survive.
In this hour, a visit with Oren Lyons, the Faith Keeper. I'm Joe Morton. When Dances with Wolves won the Academy Award for the Best Picture of the Year, the recognition confirmed a turning point in the perception of the American Indian. The film was free of those cliches of the Old West created in the earliest days of Hollywood. These Native Americans spoke in their own language.
Here. Buffalo. Go. Buffalo. Tatanka.
They expressed human emotions and humor, and they appeared as neither victims nor savages, but as real people living in real time in touch with the land. The movie has been widely praised by Indians as an immense breakthrough in the perception of Native peoples. For Native Americans like Oren Lyons, that breakthrough was a long time coming. Chief Lyons is the faith keeper of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga Nation and has devoted his life to preserving the experiences and wisdom of his people and interpreting them to the dominant American culture. He serves now as Director of Native American Studies at the State University of New York at Buffalo, but he also plays an active and peripatetic role in representing the Iroquois and other Native peoples on issues ranging from the environment to land claims and the restoration of sacred symbols. One of his mandates as faith keeper of his tribe is to keep alive the legends and stories of his people's traditions. You're an artist, and this is your drawing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a painting. It's a depiction of the Great Tree of Peace and the two individuals who had the most to do with it, the great peacemaker who is on the left as we look at it, and Œİěnwénta, who was his supporter. The Tree of Peace, of course, is the great spiritual law, and it sits on the back of the turtle, which is our metaphor for this island we call North America the Great Turtle Island. Interspersed and intertwined among the leaves of the tree and around the tree, gathered around it, are the great clans, the deer clan. And the deer is recognized as the leader of the animals. The hawk who sits in the tree, the bear, who is another powerful, mysterious entity, and the wolf, who is our spiritual brother in this life. He's recognized by Native people around the world as a very powerful entity. And over on the left, on the neck of the turtle, is a snipe, which is a clan, which are a huge family.
Every part of that painting is a symbol.
Yes, and when the peacemaker had planted the Tree of Peace, he placed the eagle on the top. And the eagle would belong to everyone. And the eagle would sit there in vigilance and watch and would scream when things were coming towards the tree. And he said that there will come a time when this tree will be attacked. And we can look at that at this time, or we could have looked at it in 1776, or we could have looked at it in 1620. You know, when it's come under attack. And today, it's still here. The tree is still standing, and we the chiefs of the Longhouse are dedicated to its continuance and to its future.
When you say the tree is still here, you mean spiritually?
Spiritually, yes. It was a spiritual tree to begin with. You know, because people, again, people are so literal. It's hard at times to have a discussion with people who think in linear terms, because they say, we come to see the tree. And they say, it's a great tree. It reaches to the heavens. You can't see it. You can't see it, we can see it. But it's there, and it's very real. Again, as we were told, sometimes the most real things you can't see.
Oren Lyons was an All-American lacrosse player at Syracuse University, and in 1983 helped found a team called the Iroquois Nationals. In 1990, they traveled to Australia for the Lacrosse World Championship Games, the first time in over 100 years that the Iroquois carried their own flag and performed their own anthem in international competition. He says lacrosse is as native to the Indians as they are to the landscape.
Nice job.
We watched the children playing lacrosse yesterday.
Yeah.
Does it teach them something, or is it just for the heck of it?
No, I think lacrosse in Iroquois is synonymous with life, I think, or it's synonymous with continuation of community. Everybody's involved. Children's involved, parents are involved. Our greatest fans, the greatest lacrosse fans are the women. Women love the game. And it's more than a game, has been.
What do you mean more than a game? You were a star goalie back in the 50s. Wasn't it just a game to you then?
No, you could have called me a ringer because I'd been playing lacrosse for so long by the time that I got to the university that I had, a great deal of experience. Because our people do it, from this little fellows on up. And my grandfather was a lacrosse player. My father was a well-known goalkeeper. It goes back, it's not only us. Some of the great leaders, Tecumseh was a great lacrosse player.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. These people, Osceola was noted for his lacrosse playing.
Is lacrosse ceremony? Is it
Yes,
ritual?
it is. Oh, yes. It's,
As I look at it, what am I seeing?
Well, first of all, it's a spiritual game. Its origin, it's called the Creator's game.
Lacrosse?
Lacrosse is the Creator's game, and he loves to have the contest and the vitality of the contest. And so the harder you play, you're supposed to play it as hard as you can, and but don't cheat, and you do things fair. Everything is always fair. Always fair. Do things fair.
And this game was here as long as your memory takes you back?
As long as we can remember. And I think an important point to make at this time was that this was a team sport. This was a sport, and it was played by teams of people. That's a comment on a society where our technology, we have great technology. It's too bad I don't have a snow snake here to show you.
A what?
A snow snake. It's a game that we invented that long, slender wood, which is carved to real fine finish, and it's shellacked, and it's varnished, and it's waxed, and it can be thrown a mile in the snow, in the track. Now, that's technology. That's real technology, but we put it into a game. We didn't develop the F-16. We didn't go in that direction. We were people who sat under a tree for a long time, talked about things, talked about society, talked about the importance of community, talked about law, talked about rules. Indian country, this Onondaga has got a lot of rules here. Mohawks have a lot of rules. How do you live there? How do you live? None of it written.
Oren Lyons was a successful commercial artist in New York City before returning to his people to take up his duties as faith keeper. He lives on native land near Syracuse, and we met in his cabin there for this conversation.
Why did you come back here to live on the reservation? You gave up a successful career as a commercial artist in New York City.
Well, several reasons. First of all, I believe I learned all I needed to learn about New York City. Probably stayed 2-3 years too long. The other, of course, was to come back and get back into harness, so to speak, here more directly with the people. And 1967, I was condoled as one of the faith keepers.
Condoled?
Yes, that's a process of raising leadership in the န့ěᓂዀભાڨgy. It's, people ask the question all the time, how did you become a chief? And it goes back to the roots of democracy.
Were you chosen by a vote of the people?
No, it doesn't work that way. A long time ago, when we first began the process of our governance, when we were given this government, the peacemaker, we call him the great peacemaker, came amongst us, brought peace amongst the Mohawk and the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And we laid down the rules at that time. We don't know how long ago. Maybe 1,000 years ago, maybe 2.
Maybe more.
It may be more. It doesn't matter.
This is the legend.
Yeah.
That's come down.
This is the story.
The peacemaker was a visitor?
He was a spiritual being. He was a messenger, we would say, the best we could say. He brought a message, the great peace. And it was a long process of how he changed the minds of all of these men who at that time were leaders by strength and by force. And he stepped in there and changed that whole process to deliberation and thought. And he convinced these warriors at that time, who were the leaders, to join with him. And he changed their minds. And he moved from the Mohawk first to the Oneida, and then he moved to the Onondaga. He couldn't deal with the leader at Onondaga, the ÄĆÄ. So he went on to the Cayuga and the Seneca, and they all came back. And when they came back, they had the support of their minds. They had agreed. These men had changed. And so
because they had listened to the
peacemaker and his message. Now, but he had to bring the Onondagas in, and he did, you know.
Who were stubborn people?
Very stubborn. Well, in particular, the man, the leader of the time, the ÄÄ, was fierce. He was a man with snakes in his hair. He was a man who was twisted and deformed and fierce and a cannibal. He was so powerful that people feared him, and he just stayed in the woods, hard to reach. And so they were given help, spiritual help, in the terms of a song from a bird. And this song was what they learned and what they came to him with. And as they approached all these leaders, all these people singing this song, with this peacemaker and ÄĆÄ in front, who some people now call ÄĆÄ. ÄÄ and the peacemaker worked together on this great work. And they approached him. And as they approached him with this, and they convinced him, and they said that if he agreed to join this great law, this great peace, that Onondaga would be the center fire, would be the fire keepers. The Onondaga would be the fire keepers of the ÄĆÄ. And the ÄÄ would be the name of the Confederation, who the French call Iroquois and who the English call Six Nations. And so the ÄÄ came about, and he agreed. And he became the spiritual leader. And they said all of those 50 original men from those nations, their names became offices. And when one passed on, then a ceremony was performed, a condolence of replacement. So then this was the peaceful replacement of authority. It was a very simple process. What he had established in our laws was that each of those leaders was a leader of a family. And his family was a clan. The clans were given designations of a wolf, of a turtle, of a deer, of a bear, of a snipe, of an eel, of a beaver, of a heron, all of these designations. And so then there would be in each of these clans 5 leaders. There would be a clan mother whose purpose was to choose the chief.
Why the mother? Why did that go to the woman?
Well, because in his first encounter, as he landed on the eastern shores of what is now called Lake Ontario, he stopped overnight at a lodge of a woman. And this woman took him in and said that this was a place where people could stop and could refresh themselves and could eat. And it was a neutral place. And even though it was a warpath that it was on, everybody that came there recognized that this was a neutral place for peace, and
so they leave
spend the night,
leave their weapons outside,
and they pass that particular time together. So when he told her of his mission and what he was about, she said, "That's wonderful. I agree with that." And so her name was ؐηνέχዀ ˋģīnhā, or of the Cat Nation, the Erie. And so he went on about his business, and then he discovered this other man by the name of ȳên 옌թā, who was an Onondaga by birth and who was adopted by the Mohawk in the process. So he established the process of adoption during all of this. At any rate, the two worked together. And so it was they who were in the lead of the group of men that were approaching Tadadaho with the song. And as they approached him, he transformed and agreed to this great peace. And
you mean the people approaching, singing the sound of the bird?
Of the bird.
And this creature with wild hair and a twisted body, as you say, he responded.
He responded. He agreed.
He changed.
He changed. And there was a law, there was a lesson there for everyone. And that lesson was, no matter how bad a person is, he can change to be the very best.
He can be born again.
Exactly. It was, I hesitate to use that word because it has such a different connotation today. Yeah. But really,
well, a spiritual conversion. That's the metaphor, isn't it?
It was a spiritual conversion.
And the woman, that custom still prevails, that the woman who greeted the peacemaker chooses the next chief?
At that time, as we moved along, you know, in his process of when he sat down, he said, this society will follow, because the woman was the first to recognize, they said the society will follow the woman's side, become a matriarchal society, matrilineal society. Also what that did very clearly was it established the nationhood. Any child was born with an identity. He had a nation, he had the clan, and whatever his gender or her. And so we had, if it was a boy, we had a lacrosse player, and if it was a girl, we had someone who inherited the power
of choice.
So
who chose you?
Well, my clan mother at that time.
What clan?
Turtle. I was chosen, although I am a wolf. I am a wolf. And I was borrowed into the Turtle clan at that time. A wonderful woman who raised many generations of children. She carried, at some point here at Onondaga Nation, 4 clanships in her hand because of the inability to find a clan mother for those clans. She carried all that extra work. And so she was about getting these things parceled out and getting them done. And she asked me whether I would consider that. And I
consider becoming
one of the representatives of the Turtle clan in council. And I said, well, you know, your first reaction is you don't want to do that because the chiefs are always busy, they're always working, they're never home, they're always in meetings, and it seemed to be quite a load. But she said, well, don't answer. She said, don't answer. Now, think about it. And the only words she ever said to me was, think of what you can do for your people. So finally I said, well, I'll try. She said, that's good. That's all I want to hear.
Was it a hard choice to bring your kids back from New York to live here?
No, it was, I think, probably the best thing I could have done for them.
Where do they belong? Here or out in that other world?
Everybody belongs here. All Onondagas belong here, whether they live there or not. It's the same if you had a U.S. citizenship and you were living in Paris. You know, you always go back to America, right?
Okay.
It's the same. So if you're an Onondaga and you're living in Boston, which they are, and if you're living in New York, which they are, your home is here.
The conflict, it seems to me, is that you just outlined a wonderful story of a consciousness from another time and another mentality, and they're facing all the time, your children, the technology of the modern world, which seduces them away from the intuitive thinking.
Oh yeah, no doubt. There's an attrition. Sure, every generation has faced an attrition. But on the other hand, there's also a distillation.
Okay.
And the distillation of these ideas, of these thoughts here, and the society itself, the importance of the leadership and the chiefs and the clan mothers and the message that they have is extraordinarily important in these times. And the teachings that are there. I mentioned the second message, which was the Great Peace. And we had a third message. Third message came around 1799. And if you go back in history, this was directly after the Revolutionary War. When you're looking at the turmoil that was in Indian country, particularly Six Nation country during that time, we had a third message from ญีếnផាᎯဿ who people call Handsome Lake. Handsome Lake was taken on a journey, shall we say, for 4 days. And during that time, he was shown the future of what was going to happen, and he was given instructions on how to deal with the white man.
Instructions by?
By the four protectors, by the spiritual side of our life. And so they told him what was coming. And this summer, that story will be told again here in this longhouse, as it's told every year in every longhouse across the Six Nations.
What did he say was coming? What will you observe? What will you think about this?
Well, it goes on and on.
Well,
just 4 days of it.
Is there a central message?
Yeah, the central message is there is going to be a deterioration and a falling away of life as we know it. There's going to be destruction. There's, well, for instance, how these things were told. And I have to be quite careful about how I do this because we're on national television. I don't have the authority and the right to begin just discussing things at large without the consent of the nation or the people. So I'm not free to do that. But it's clear enough, and people have known enough, for instance, for water, talked about water. He was shown things in vignettes. And he said, they would ask him, what do you see? He said, well, I see a river. And they said, well, pick up the water to drink. And he reached his hands in there and picked the water up, and he said, I can't, it's filthy. They said, we think what you say is correct, and in sometime the water's going to be that way.
So he was anticipating the environmental degradation.
Yes.
That it's now no legend.
Mm-hmm. And at one time he was shown a field of corn. A field. It wasn't corn. It was a garden. And someone was working in the garden. And he described that, and they said, observe. And at one point the man reached down and pulled up the plant, to see what was on the roots. And there was nothing on the root. He said, what do you see? He says, he's pulled a plant and there's nothing there.
So what do you make of that?
What they were told, as he saw, he was told a lot about these things that were coming. Well, he said, well, what is the hope? Well, they said, it's certain that this will happen. And I said, but that's up to each generation to see that it doesn't happen in your generation.
So the lesson, the vision he received, the chief received, was that destruction, environmental destruction, physical destruction could come in every generation, but each generation is charged not to let it happen.
Yeah, and so actually, the hope lies in the intensity of the life of that generation. You can only live one day at a time, regardless.
And yet the publication that you produce, Daybreak, is dedicated to the 7th generation unborn.
Yeah, that was the instructions that were given as a chief. When we were given these instructions, among many of them, one was that when you sit in council for the welfare of the people, you counsel for the welfare of that 7th generation to come. They should be foremost in your mind. Not even your generation, not even yourself, but those that are unborn. So that when their time comes here, they may enjoy the same thing that you are enjoying now.
Is there kind of a moral obligation to that?
Well, I believe, that all of this discussion between human beings is one of morality. I think that everyone has to deal with the emotions that are in each individual. And we understand that we have both good and bad in us, and that you must strike a balance at all times. And this spiritual center, then, is what the great tree of peace is. It's a spiritual center. It's a spiritual
peacemaker,
law.
when he came, planted a tree of peace.
A tree of peace, a great law. It's a spiritual law. He said, when you become afraid, or when you become weak, or when you become not able to carry, he says, it's the spiritual law that will stiffen your spine. He said, that's where your strength is. So you must make your laws in accordance with those spiritual laws, and then you will survive. So he called that council the Council of the Good Minds. He said, the Œyenန့, that's what it means, the all good, the good, peacemakers. So that's what he set up. And when he uprooted this great tree, and he asked the nations to come forward and cast their weapons of war, he says, we now do away with the warriors, and we do away with the war chiefs. And in their place, we plant the Council of the Good Minds, who will now counsel for the welfare of the people. And he said, I shall not leave you defenseless. And he gave us a spiritual strength. Âyen낳YANQUA the great tobacco. He said, this will be your medium for communication directly.
The great tobacco?
Yeah, we have sacred tobacco. He said, this is your spiritual strength.
The peace pipe, then, is a metaphor as well as a physical object, a material object.
Actually. And that's why, you know, this peace is so foremost in our minds. And so he said, now we will, the three principles will be peace, equity, and justice, and the power of the good minds. So everyone must think that way. And when your people think that way, and everyone has the same position and the same mind, of being of one mind, which is the greatest power there is. And so that's what we're instructed to
But you know, the history of your people since the peacemaker came millennia ago has been one like of other people of enmity and conflict and competition. The great teachings, the wise and wonderful philosophy are breached so often and have been breached so often in the fact, in our behavior.
Yeah, it's the visionaries, you know, in talking or understanding Black Elk's vision.
You know,
what
Dakota,
he said,
yes, the Dakotas.
In the Dakotas, yeah, the great Dakota people, Lakota. His vision was very much along with ours. And then when we hear the stories of other nations, of how they came to be, when we hear how the Hopis talk about the Spider Woman and coming from the earth and the fourth world that they've experienced, the fourth failure of man, again try, how they come forward and try again. We hear the walkabout songs of the Aboriginal people in Australia when they talk about singing into existence these beings of, you know, all the entities of the world, as far as they are concerned, has a song. And we say, that's wonderful. We agree. We say, yes, now hear our story. This is how we came. And they listen to us and they say, that's wonderful. We believe that.
But your story, look what the gun, the church, the dollar, and the bottle did to your story. You got run over.
Well, you pretty much put them all down. This is what they talked about at the time. We did and we didn't. We're still here. We're not through. The story's not over. You're still talking to a chief. You're still talking, and you're sitting here in the Onondaga Nation, the center of the jourdîn-O-Shōni. The tree is still here. The roots are still out. And if anything, I see the roots growing at this point.
And what do you mean? What's the evidence that...
Well, as I watched, you know, especially in the Eastern Bloc of Europe, you know, how these people are clamoring for freedom and for democracy, and how they're looking, you know, towards the Americas for democracy, and how the Chinese were using the symbol of the Statue of Liberty as democracy, and they were saying, this is great, this is coming from America, but America got it from the Indians. America got the ideas of democracy and freedom and peace here.
Do you subscribe to the opinion that some of what we call founding fathers were affected directly by what Indians were doing and thinking in the shaping of government?
They were impacted very directly. You know, when the Wampanoags met the Pilgrims, there was a great leader by the name of Massasoit, and Massasoit saw to it that there was peace between the two. And now we see it as our grandfathers talked to Benjamin Franklin and talked to those people. And
they did talk to Franklin?
They did talk to Franklin. They explained very directly, you know, in this meeting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1744.
Franklin was there?
Franklin was taking recording. He was the recording secretary at the time. He was a young man, you know, and of course they were talking to I think it was the governor of Delaware, New York, and Pennsylvania at the time.
The chiefs were?
Chiefs, the Six Nation chiefs were talking. And they advised them then to join in a union like the န့ěƞობაში and be like us. They said, because there's a great power in being together of one mind. We have unity. As the peacemaker bound, you know, those arrows, when he was illustrating to the chiefs, he took one arrow. He said, this is a nation. And he snapped the arrow. And then he took the 5 nations and 5 arrows, and he bound it with the sinew of the deer. And then he said, you can't break this unity. He says, this is your symbol, unity. You must be united. You must be of one mind.
Is there any indication that Ben Franklin was influenced by what he heard and recorded?
Oh, I think there's a lot of evidence. One of the things that he did, I think he's the one that was listening. The three politicians, shall we say, were not listening, but Benjamin Franklin was I would say, the visionary. He saw the nation. He saw a free nation. He said, why? He said, why? If these, as I think the quote was something like, if this group of ignorant savages can build something that looks indissoluble, he said, why can we not, who have all of the same needs, do the same, more or less? So he called a meeting in 1754 in Albany, New York, called the Albany Plan of Union. And at that time, he had asked the chiefs of Six Nation and other Indians to come forward and talk about the process of governance and the process of representation in government and the process of the peaceful transference of power from one generation to the next. 2 houses, a discussion, power of people in the hands of the people. And all of this really intrigued him. And of course, the King of England wasn't too happy with all of this and kind of put a stop to it rather quickly, but it was on its way. And just on the eve of the Revolution, in 1775, delegates from the Continental Congress met with the Six Nation chiefs and said at the time that your grandfathers advised us in 1744 in Lancaster to make a union such as yours, and now we're going to take your advice. And we're going to plant a tree of peace in Philadelphia that will reach to the sky, and people can come under it. And they used our metaphors, and they used all of the, and the chief said, that's wonderful, good, we'd like to hear that. And they said, we want neutrality in the coming war. And that's what the chief said. It's a fight between the father and son. We love you both. We know you both. And we agree that we should be neutral. So a treaty was struck then in 1776 in Fort Pitt. And it was delegates from the Continental Congress came and brought a great belt, a peace belt with 13 diamonds in it. And not the diamonds that you wear on your finger, but a design of 13 diamonds representing the 13 colonies. And this belt was taken by the Six Nations. They agreed to this peace, which is really expunged from your history.
How does it affect you when you go back and look at the record, despite the sympathetic signals that went back and forth between some of the first Americans, your people, and some of the new Americans, the Franklins and the Jeffersons and others, how In time, one treaty after another was broken. Slavery was practiced by these very men who wrote We the People. Your own people shunted aside to reservations. Today, decimated by alcohol, despair. You yourself have talked to colleagues of mine about the drug use among young people, the rise of crime. I mean, what?
Well, it's interesting because I think stepping back from the world and looking at it from a distance and looking at it from the time, you would say that in North America at that time, they took an ember, they took a light from our fire, and they carried that over, and they lighted their own fire. They made their own nation. They lighted this great fire. And there was a great light at that time of peace, because that's what they said they were following. And that came about, 1776, there was this great light, and this earth, if you saw the earth from back, you would see this brilliance. And then as time went on, the brilliance died down. It began to die down. And what happened? And the question that you asked was, first of all, they refused to deal with the issue of slavery right at that time. That light started to die immediately. They refused to use spirituality as part of their nation. Died a little bit more. We said, you're going to have trouble. Our advice to you was the spiritual center. And you say, you separate the church from the state, but you already had conflict. So they separated, and we said, problem coming. And so then what was beginning to happen, the things that were brought from across the sea began to reassert themselves. And once they established their position and became strong, and the light diminished more. And so when you came through the 19th century, the 19th century is a terrible page in the history of America, what happened to Indians. It's a terrible page, and many, many millions of people were killed and died. And so this process died. And suddenly, at the end of the century, in turn of the century, the 20th century, the word was to carry a big stick and to talk softly.
Theodore Roosevelt.
But what was that? It was imperialism. Again, an expansion of power over, dominion over. It was not agreeing with. And so we are now facing another situation. Can we get this light? Can we get this great light to come again? And that's up to this generation. That's up to really, we're elders, you and I now. I mean, we can say, from our older position, it looks like a lost cause. But if you were to speak to the young man, the young person, the young woman, she'd say, no, this is my life. I shall survive. You can't tell me that it's lost. That's my determination. She will say, and he will say that, and they are saying it. So we can say, well, it looks bad from here. And from there they say, well, it looks tough, but it isn't lost. And that's the law that they were talking about from Œ균연다요 when he said, don't let it be your generation. And the law prevails, what we call the great law, the common law, the natural law.
And the law says?
The law says if you poison your water, you'll die. The law says that if you poison the air, you'll suffer. The law says if you degrade where you live, you'll suffer. The law says all of this. And if you don't learn that, then you can only suffer. There's no discussion with this law.
There's no mercy in nature. You can't get out on your knees and ask forgiveness, can you? Nature takes back what you've done to it.
Yes.
That's the spiritual law?
That's really a spiritual law. It's a very important thing for people to understand, that when you transgress, there's a time. See, people don't operate in the world time, or say the time of the mountain. They operate in the time of the human being. And that's probably not a good idea, because the time of the human being is rather short. And yet when you're dealing in the time of an oak tree, or a time of one of the great sequoias, and you kill that tree, your technology today, and you can take a chainsaw and in 10 minutes kill a tree that's 400 years old. There's no way that you can make that tree grow. You'll have to wait another 400 years for it to get to that position. And so the technology has kind of overtaken the common sense of human beings and the understanding of time. And just as the time of the ant is very, very short, the time of the mountain is very long, the rivers, and the time of the human being sort of has to be passed along. And if you don't have a reference point, if you don't have a good understanding of what this time is, then you can get yourself and your people and your generation into a whole lot of trouble. And I think that's where we are right now.
What kind of trouble do you mean? You're talking about environmental trouble?
Yes, indeed. I'm talking about making payment now. As long as I can remember, and as long as I guess in the memory of our people, we've had celebrations for the thundering voices, our grandfathers, the rainmakers, the people that bring the rain and bring the fresh water. They refresh the springs and the lakes.
Doesn't your language refer to the rain as grandfather?
As a grandfather.
And the sun as uncle?
Yes, they do indeed. But now, suddenly, the rain that we celebrate and the rain that we pray for and the rain that we thanksgiving for begins to kill. What is that? What happens when your grandfathers begin to turn on you? And your great brother, the elder brother, the son, when suddenly people begin to suffer from cancer from the sun. So what are people going to do when these life-giving forces that you've depended on, that you've prayed to, that you recognize, give thanksgiving to, suddenly turn on you? What happens?
Exactly what do indigenous people, Indians, have to offer in this regard to the rest of us?
First of all, we have a long perspective. We've been in one place a long time. We've seen the sun come up the same place many, many hundreds, thousands of years. And so we have a familiarity with the earth itself. The elements, we know about them. And we know what it is to enjoy that. And so the ceremonies, which are as ancient as we are, carry forward this respect. Our people were always spiritual people, religious people. They always had ceremonies. This was our first instruction, was the ceremony. How do you carry that on? And the ceremonies were our thanksgivings, every one of them. So we have these extraordinary rounds of Thanksgiving every year. So all the same songs again at certain times, all the same dances at certain times. Very familiar. Again, if you go down and watch the Pueblos, as they do their deer dance, as they do their bean dance, and watch the Hopis as they do their snake dance. These are old, ancient ceremonies. Everybody knows them, and everybody participates in them, and you continue because they are what you were instructed to do, which is to give thanks.
For what?
For what is given to you here. Pilgrims got a hold of it, and they called it Thanksgiving. But there's only one, that's only the harvest part of it. They don't go all the way around the whole clock, Children are not sat down and taught about what's good and what's wrong. What they see is they see their grandfathers, or they see their fathers, or their mothers, their grandmothers going to ceremonies. And they say, so that must be the right thing to do. The old people do it. Everybody does it. That's good. So they do it. And so they learn in the process. The Thanksgiving, what is it for? Well, this one is for the maple, the chief of the trees. We're giving a Thanksgiving for the maple. Good. Must respect the tree. Must respect all the trees. So respect is learned through ceremony. There's a process. It's an old one. And so Thanksgiving comes as a natural way. It's a being. It's part of life. It's not something that you do occasionally. It's something you do all the time. And that's how the process has been passed down. And so we have these well springs of knowledge about places that only Aboriginal people would know because they've lived there. They have intimate knowledge of what's there. And when people are destroyed and languages are destroyed, you destroy that knowledge along with it. And so what you're saying, what do they have to offer indigenous people, I think may have the long-term thinking required for proper context.
Context being
life as it functions in the cycles, in the great cycles of life, as we do our cycle of being born and going back to the earth again, as a tree is a sapling and grows to full being and then falls as it goes back to the earth again. As the spring comes and the fall and the winter, and it comes again. It's endless, the cycle, as long as you protect the cycle, as long as you participate in the cycle, as long as you honor it and respect it. Then it will continue, but it doesn't have to.
Do you think it's a given that human beings are a permanent feature of this natural world? I mean, does the world need us that much?
The world doesn't need us at all. I think it's probably better off. Where the world is concerned, what we call the wilderness, which is again an English term. Indians even have a word for wild. They didn't know what that meant. So out there in this pristine, shall we say, lands where everybody wants to go and see and be for a little while. That's the beauty of a place. And sometimes there's people there who are so unintrusive that you don't even see them. They've acclimated to the place. They live there with it, as part of it. And that's the people who have a knowledge.
More and more people are turning to natives, to Indians, and saying, share your knowledge with us. But don't you think, honestly now, practically, it is too late? For how many years have we had the dominant note, the clarion trumpet of conquer the earth? You have dominion over the earth. And we're building cities to create habitats far removed from this. Our mentality is a part of that civilization now. What you're talking about is wonderful and wise. The stories are profound and instructive, and yet irrelevant.
Well, maybe.
To this modern world.
It may be irrelevant at the moment. We don't preach here in this our country. We don't proselytize. We try to, in matter of fact, we try to protect what we have from intrusion. And yet, at a meeting that was held in Hopi back in 1969, when we sat there with many Indian leaders from around the country, spiritual leaders, and they talked about these young people who were sitting on our doorsteps every day when we got up, and they come from all over the country, and they were coming to be an Indian, or they were coming to learn something about us. And we said, this is a very strange phenomenon, that our white brothers' children are now coming to our doorstep and wanting to be part of us. We don't know what we do with this, And so one of the Hopi elders said, well, we have a prophecy about that. They said that there's going to come a time when they're going to come and ask for direction. Maybe this is what's happening. So it came under discussion, and it was agreed upon at that time that perhaps this may be true. And if it is, then we should be more responsive then to the questions, and we should maybe try to help, to see what we can do, to pass on whatever we can, however we can. And so it was agreed upon at that time that we would work more directly then. And we have been much more directly since that time. How much can be imparted is hard to say. But the isms of this world, communism, capitalism, all of these isms are really quite bereft of a spiritual side to it. And what we were told when we made our laws, when the great law was put down, was to have the spiritual center of it, the center of the law, to be spiritual, the great law. And so when we see people who don't deal with this entirely, then we say, well, it's only going to be a matter of time when it's going to come to a problem.
The reality of human beings keeps intruding on the stories and the philosophy, the instructions.
Well, it's an ongoing discussion. With each generation has to learn. What Indians are about, I think, first of all, is community. They're about mutual support. They're about sharing. They're about understanding what's common land, common air, common water, common and for all, They're about freedom.
But they're divided and separated onto reservations. Many of those who come into the larger world perish psychologically, emotionally, spiritually.
And on the reservations as well. But this is an intrusion again by our white brother. He has made these reservations. He has controlled that. You know, we've gone from a great power to a small power. Now, Chief Seattle said, as the waves come, one behind the other, he said, so nations come. And as the waves disappear, so nations disappear. So perhaps, he said, this is what will happen to us.
Don't your people call yourselves the real people?
Yeah, the real people.
The real people in the sense of not exclusion. That's not meant, as I understand it, in an exclusionary sense. It means we are here.
Yes,
material people.
Yes.
We are part of this physical world.
We are now. We are now. Now is us. We're the seventh generation. I'm sitting here as the seventh generation because 7 generations ago, those people were looking out for me. 7 generations from now, someone will be here, I know. And so each generation makes sure that 7 generations is coming all the time.
And that's accountability, right?
And that's accountability. We're accountable. We, you, and I, we're accountable. Yes, we are. And they are going to call us. They're the ones that are going to say, why did you do this? Or why did you not do this?
I wish I could believe that about the human being, because when I see what, this generation has been handed, our present generation has been handed quite a legacy. Pollution, poisoned rivers, forests disappearing, these 500-year-old trees you talk about being cut down for the bottom line now. I mean, I'm not sure that what you call the 7th generation and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson call posterity are getting a fair deal.
Oh, life isn't fair, is it? Life has never been fair. It's a hard lesson, because when you're young and you're brought up, you're protected, and people make sure that things are even and divided equally among the children, and all of a sudden when you're out, you find out, no, it doesn't work that way. How come I'm sick and he isn't? How come they died, or this is going to happen here? But that's life. And as we say, each person is born with a number of days in your hand. When you come to the end of that number, then that's your time. And see, people say, well, they died too soon. They didn't finish. No, they finished. They finished what they were going to do. That was it. And so it's not fatalistic as much as a reality. Your part and your time. Time that you're a great tree, Remember the words of Red Jacket when he said, I'm an old man. He says, my limbs are old and there's no leaves on them and I'm ready to fall. He says, but my heart fails me when I think of the children and what faces them. He's talking about me. Well, I'm here. I feel pretty good. And the other thing, I guess, is very important is that we shouldn't take ourselves so seriously.
Even a chief.
Well, especially a chief, I guess, I think you're just a human being, really, and you happen to take on a responsibility that anybody else could have taken on if they wanted to do it and took the commitment to do it. And you begin to see the serious side of things quite a bit, but nevertheless, in all of this, there's life to be lived. I said an instruction, and the instruction was to give thanks. There was a second instruction that I didn't mention. That was to enjoy life.
What sustains you?
Well, my belief in the people, my belief in the ceremonies, my belief in the earth, and really kind of optimistic coming all down to it.
ҵഃန့ said recently that hope is not optimism. Hope is a state of the spirit, a state of the soul.
Yeah, I deal in reality. I deal very much in reality. In order for us to have survived up to this point, we have to deal in reality.
But you see, you have survived because have you survived? I mean, indigenous people have lived for centuries close to nature, in harmony with this world, and yet you've been overwhelmed by the material progress of the industrial society. Have you really survived, or is it just the stories that survive?
No, I don't think so. I think the spirit is quite there, and I think the spirit is manifested outside as we look about here. It's out here. We're told about the Longhouse, about the ceremonies, power of the ceremonies, and the thanksgiving that we were instructed to do. I said, as long as there's one to sing and one to dance, one to speak and one to listen, life will go on. So as long as the instructions are being carried out, even if it's down to the last 4, life will go on.
From the Onondaga Nation in upstate New York, this has been a conversation with Chief Oren Lyons. I'm Bill Moyers.